In this video, I'm going to talk about the biological basis of depression. And I'm not talking about just a passing bad mood, but I'm talking about major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder is a major cause of distress, disability, and death from suicide. It is the prototype of the category of mental illnesses called the depressive disorders, which involve distress or disability from abnormally negative mood. In addition to negative mood, the depressive disorders often involve related symptoms, such as feelings of hopelessness or loss of enjoyment in activities. As of 2014, when I'm making this video, our understanding of the cause of major depressive disorder is still very limited. When we look at the brains of patients that have major depressive disorder, either with the naked eye or with traditional microscope studies, there are basically no consistent abnormalities that have been seen in the tissues of these patients. However, special scans and research involving animal models have suggested that there are some functional abnormalities that can be detected in the brains of many patients with major depressive disorder. So here in this illustration of the brain, we're looking at the outside of the brain, and the different lobes of the cerebrum, the top part of the brain, have been labeled with different colors. And in this illustration, we're also looking at the brain, but it's been divided into right and left halves, and we're looking at the inside of, in this case, the left half of the brain. And a couple of specific areas that seem to have abnormal activity in these studies involve this part of the brain in this light blue color, which is called the frontal lobe. Let me just write that. Frontal lobe, the lobe that's most toward the front of the brain. And over here on the inside, that would be all of this stuff. All of this stuff right here is also the frontal lobe. And the other part can't be seen on the outside, it can only be seen on this inside view. It involves a number of different structures, like this structure here, and some others that are behind the brainstem over here, that are called the limbic structures. Let me just write that word down, the limbic structures. Limbic structures, right here. And these studies have suggested that there appears to be abnormally decreased activity in areas of the frontal lobe and areas of increased activity in areas of the limbic structures. These findings seem to fit well with other studies showing a role for these parts of the brain in regulation of the emotions, and in particular, responses to stress. Functions of the brain that seem to be particularly abnormal in patients with major depressive disorder. In regards to stress, it's also been noted that many patients with major depressive disorder have abnormal blood concentrations of certain hormones that are particularly associated with stress. For example, the hormone cortisol, that's a major stress hormone. There's a particular area of the brain that controls most hormones, including the stress hormones, that's located right here. And this area is called the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus talks back and forth to many areas of the brain, but two areas in particular that it communicates with back and forth are the frontal lobes and the limbic structures of the brain. So it's thought that perhaps abnormal communication between the frontal lobes and the limbic structures and the hypothalamus in major depressive disorder play a role in why there are these abnormal concentrations of certain hormones related to stress in the bloodstream of these patients. These stress hormones may affect most tissues of the body, but they also affect the brain itself, including the frontal lobes, the limbic structures, and the hypothalamus that actually controls their amounts in the blood in the first place. So for major depressive disorder, it's still unclear which abnormalities of these stress hormones are causes and which are effects of the disease itself. Some features of major depressive disorder also appear to involve abnormalities in neuronal pathways using certain neurotransmitters, the molecules that communicate between neurons in the brain. And the abnormalities of these pathways may cause abnormally decreased or increased activity in certain parts of the brain, like the frontal lobes and the limbic structures. Collections of many of these neurons that produce these neurotransmitters have their somas, or their cell bodies, in a few areas of the brainstem, this structure below the cerebrum, and then their axons project to many areas up in the cerebrum, including the frontal lobes and the limbic structures. One of these pathways start in what are called the raphe nuclei of the brainstem. And there are several groups of raphe nuclei at different levels of the brainstem that send projections up to many areas of the cerebrum, including the limbic structures and the frontal lobe. And they're responsible for much of the serotonin that's secreted in the brain. Serotonin, which appears to be abnormal in many patients with major depressive disorder. Another pathway starts in an area called the locus coeruleus. Which is located right around here in the brainstem, and it also sends long axons up to different areas of the cerebrum and releases a lot of the neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. Norepinephrine. And this also appears to be abnormal in many patients with major depressive disorder. And then there's a pathway that starts with an area called the ventral tegmental area, which I'll just write as VTA for short, which is located around here in the brainstem, and which also sends long axons up to different areas of the cerebrum. And the ventral tegmental area supplies much of the dopamine to the brain. Dopamine. These neurotransmitter systems affect the function in many parts of the brain, including the frontal lobes and the limbic structures, and supporting the idea that abnormalities of these systems are involved in major depressive disorder is the fact that medications that affect these different neurotransmitters, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, often improve the symptoms of major depressive disorder. A newer idea that is interesting is that there may be abnormalities of what is called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, which is a big word that just means that the brain changes in response to experience. And these changes may occur down at the level of a connection between a couple of brain cells, a couple of neurons in the brain, where the strength or efficiency of information flow from one neuron to the next may change based on experience. Or it may happen at the level of networks of neurons that are widespread, different kinds of connections and pathways that information is flowing through the brain based on the experiences that the brain is having. And evidence is accumulating that aspects of neuroplasticity appear to be abnormal in animal models of major depressive disorder. But like the other abnormalities that have been found so far, it's unclear if these abnormalities of neuroplasticity are a cause or an effect of major depressive disorder. So there have been a number of biological abnormalities found to go along with the mental abnormalities we see in major depressive disorder. Biological. And other clues to biological factors that may be involved in the cause of major depressive disorder include genetic studies that suggest that a predisposition can be inherited. Several genes related to brain function have been associated with the risk of developing the disease. It may be that these genetic abnormalities increase the risk of the brain developing abnormal responses to negative or stressful events, particularly early in life when the brain is still rapidly developing in response to experience. But like most, if not all, mental disorders, in addition to the biological factors, there does appear to be psychosocial factors as well. Psychosocial factors. Certain psychosocial factors have been linked to the risk of developing major depressive disorder, such as childhood abuse, stressful events, or limited social support during adverse circumstances. So that it may be, for many, if not most, people with major depressive disorders, as with most other types of mental illness, it seems that an unfortunate constellation of both biological and psychosocial factors combine to cause the illness.
Welcome, folks. Dr. Charles Parker. I'm here to tell you about one of the most important clinical problems that we see almost every day in my outpatient offices. And we've been seeing them since the early 90s, and we've been talking about it for many, many years. And it's this following problem regarding missed diagnosis and mistreatment of comorbid attention deficit disorder and depression. So I call it the basal ganglion seesaw. If a person has depression and ADD at the same time, and one of those halves is missed, it makes the whole problem much worse. And the person feels completely untreatable, like a treatment failure. You know, if you feel like you're a treatment failure, you've been treated and treated and treated for depression, but it's not getting better, it could be that you have a significant attention deficit disorder problem associated with it. So how does the seesaw work? Well, it's really simple. On this side of the equation, the seesaw is a balance like a regular seesaw, and you got attention deficit disorder on this side and depression on this side. Okay, so attention deficit disorder has people have a problem with dopamine deficiency. I'm oversimplifying it, but let's just call it a relative dopamine deficiency, and we're going to treat that dopamine deficiency with a dopaminergic medication, something that's going to affect the dopamine function on that side of the equation. And a person who has depression, many forms of depression, predominantly serotonergically related. So you're going to use a serotonin medication for depression. Now, if you miss one of those halves, here's what happens. So assume that a person has both problems going on, but one half of it's not recognized. So what happens is a smart pediatrician comes in and sees this child with attention deficit disorder, treats the dopamine side of the equation and pulls that dopamine up appropriately. What happens to the serotonin? It actually goes down. Well, what happens when serotonin, which is already compromised, goes down? Well, the child feels like they're completely depressed. They crash very hard in the afternoon, vigorously. And what happens then, the individual, most of the time the physician will try to change the dopamine product repeatedly and miss this side of the equation. Pediatricians are not trained on the depression side. Some of them are not trained on the attention deficit disorder side, but that's how the oversight occurs. Now, if you take the other side of the equation, what happens frequently with adult psychiatrists, not all of them, and this is not all pediatricians, but this is what happens. An individual who sees only part of it, say an adult psychiatrist sees only the depression, they get the serotonin correct, but they aren't really trained to recognize attention deficit problems. In fact, many of them just don't believe in attention deficit disorder, which is a whole other thing. So what happens is you get the serotonin treated, you get the dopamine come down. What happens when a person loses their executive function? You tell me. Bipolar illness. Yeah, it's not bipolar. It is half of the diagnosis is missed. You can't treat a serotonergically related problem, a depression, with a dopamine, nor can you treat a dopamine problem with serotonin. Serotonin doesn't treat a dopamine problem. Dopamine doesn't treat a serotonin problem. So you have to treat both of the problems simultaneously. It's just like if you came in and you had heart disease, and I were a physician, I said, listen, I know you got heart disease, but I'm going to try and treat it with insulin. I'm going to give you some diabetic medication, and I'm going to cross my fingers and hope that it works for a heart disease. I don't think so. So what happens is we have two different disease states, really, for want of a better expression. One of them is dopaminergically related, one of them is serotonergically related, and we have to treat each one simultaneously, carefully, with very clear ideas of what we're doing on both sides of the equation. Very simple, very quick. Think about this. Don't treat depression with a stimulant. Don't treat ADD with a serotonergic antidepressant. It will not work. The person will get worse, and they will very likely be called, you guessed it, bipolar illness, and get a big dose of Depakote, which they don't deserve. So thanks for your attention. Talk to you later. Have a good one.